Hey guys, it's Lupe here with Team Empire. Yesterday was standard BRO for North A. I participated in the tourney. There was 8 rounds with 211 players, so it was a pretty big turnout. It was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, we did not make the top 8 cut, but my record wasn't that bad. It was X2, very proud of the record, and I feel that I played really well yesterday and have learned enough about this deck playing over the season that I can do a deck profile for it, and yesterday was a lot of fun. So today we're just going to walk through the deck I ran yesterday. So we'll start off with the ride deck. So we actually ran Hexaorb yesterday, if I can move the ride line back on screen. So we just run the Hexaorb starter just for aesthetic, and then I run the grade 1 Maple in my ride deck as opposed to the Hexaorb grade 1. I much rather value Maple being in my ride deck rather than my main deck, because I want to guarantee her every time I persona ride rather than having to fish for her from the main deck. And granted, there are cards that add to your hand based off scrying, but I don't want to chance it. I want to be guaranteed every time I persona ride I'm going to get a free body on board, and plus she gets her plus 5k. So very strong in my opinion being in the right deck, and it's super easy to get out of here. We have Hexaorb's skill already to get it out, and then we also run another card in the deck that will Soul Blast it out. So very easy to get out of your right deck. Then we run the grade 2 because its on-ride skill is very, very strong. I think it's one of the strongest ride deck skills, just being able to on-ride scry top 3. I mean, it's very strong. Nothing else to say for it, so move on to my grade 3. I choose to run Aquamarine in the ride deck. I think it's much stronger than regular Hexaorb because while plus 20k is pretty strong, and it is what we're getting on persona ride turns for all our trigger power, I much rather would have multi-attack, especially if I'm going first, because while my opponent's on grade 2, I can get up to 5 attacks, and the first swings are going to be small numbers like 10, 15k at max, 18k at max, you know, but with cards like the Wizard, he's going to be 20k if I see 2 triggers, 25 it's a front trigger, so like, I just much rather value the multi-attack, trying to push as many cards in my opponent hand early game, or damage early as fast as possible. So that's why I choose to run Aquamarine in the right deck. Now move on to the main deck. Starting off with grade 3s, we run the 3 other copies of Aquamarine, just so we can persona ride every turn, because persona ride in standard in general is very strong, but especially in this deck. Because for those of y'all that don't know, Aquamarine's skill is when she persona rides, you get triple drive, and all your trigger power is doubled. So front K becomes plus 20k to your front row, which is very scary, especially since we're multi-attacking. So we just run the 3 extra copies of it to just guarantee that we can persona ride every turn, along with keep calling out Maple if she's retired by, let's say, Gundiva. Or if she's not retired, she'll keep getting her plus 5k since we're persona riding every turn. So just persona ride is very strong in this deck. So strong that we run one of a Gratias, just so that we basically have 4 copies of persona ride in the deck. Gratias is very, very good in this deck, in my opinion. Then to round off our grade 3s, we run 3 copies of Sages. Sages is a very busted card, especially in a deck like this, which is scrying and multi-attacking. So those small swings will make your opponent either drop cards from their hand because they're scared of Sages getting his plus 10k, or they'll take it, and then it's actually perfect for us because Sages will get his plus 10k from their defensive if they hit one. And then he just helps by being another scryer in the deck. But his second skill is what helps a lot, because one of the weaknesses of decks that scry and multi-attack with lower numbers is if your opponent hits like 1 to 2 defensives, that basically shuts down your attackers. But Sages' second skill, the CB1 to gain your opponent's power after over 14k, is really, really strong. And in fact, even won me a round yesterday in the event because he just became such a huge number that my opponent could not guard. And I really like using his first skill to look at the top deck and either leave it or soul charge it if I'm about to pass turn. That way I can try to find a defensive, especially a heal or OT, which is very strong because I can choose to leave the defensive on top, and my opponent then has the knowledge that are they swinging me with smaller numbers first or like a bigger number first, then the smaller number might be shut down, especially if they don't persona ride. So I really like Sages in this deck. I see some lists run him as a 4-up, but I think 3 is pretty solid. Next, we'll move on to the grade 2s. We run 3 QT Angel. This is the other card I was talking about to get Maple out of the ride deck very early on in the game. just being able to pitch her, Soul Blast 1 draw. And what's really neat interaction with this card, which is why I really love it in the deck, is if you're pitching this on your ride up from your grade 2 to your grade 3, her skill and QT's Angel both are on standby since they're auto abilities. So I really love using her skill first, scrying the top 3, and then putting, let's say I find 2 triggers in a normal unit, then putting the normal unit on top of my deck so that I can then Soul Blast 1 to draw that unit and have 2 guaranteed triggers on top of my deck, which is very, very strong. It actually comes up in almost every game, or at least I'm adding a card to my hand that I'd rather have, like another Scryer. And what's really good is she becomes a Scryer on Persona Ride turns with her second skill to CB1, look at the top 2 cards of the deck. If I Persona Road that turn to add 1 to my hand, leave the other on top. Very, very strong skill. The only reason we run 3 instead of 4 is because it does eat up soul, which Hexaorb really needs to get our multi-attack. And while there are ways to generate soul, you don't want to eat through it too quickly, especially if it becomes a long game. Then we run 4 copies of the Wizard. This card is really, really good in the deck, being able to look at the top card of your deck, and if your Vanguard is standing, you can choose to soul charge it or leave it on top. And even the skill is really good if your Vanguard is rested and you've restood him with Hexaorb skill, because you know going into your opponent's turn if you have a defensive on top or not. So it kind of helps you damage map for your next turn, or for your opponent's next turn, which is really good in my opinion. And his second skill is also really good because every time a trigger is checked, he gets plus 5k. So a front trigger basically becomes plus 15k to him, and then every trigger becomes plus 15k. So it gets plus 5k. So every trigger is basically 15k. And it's just really good to help him become a big attacker in the deck. So I run 4 copies of him, and it really helps generate soul. Then we'll move on to the next grade 2. 4 copies of Hexaorb Sorceress, one of the best scryers in the deck. Just when placed, CB1 if you have Vanguard grade 3 or greater. To look at the top 2 cards of the deck, you can add 2 normal units from among them, or you can put however many back on top. And if you add 2 cards, you hit the bot deck a card. So this card is just really good to helping find triggers on top, putting them in a certain order. Or if you find 1 trigger, 1 normal unit, and the normal unit to hand, especially if you find a PG. This card right here helps us survive a lot because you can just, like I said, you can find PGs in your deck and specifically add them to hand without wasting a drive check. So it's really strong. And on Persona Ride turn, she kind of makes magic numbers because she gets plus 5k. So kind of like Wizard, where he gets plus 5k every time a trigger is checked, she just gets it off Persona Ride. So it's very strong for Persona Ride numbers. So we're on 4 copies. And the last grade 2 is Quadracast. In my opinion, she is one of the best cards in the deck, but she doesn't do much besides just setting up soul, which is very important. But since she can't gain power or scry in a different way besides looking at top 2, moving 1 to soul, leaving the other on top, we only run her as a 3 of, because we have, again, cards like the Wizard, who also feels soul and gains power. I think if she gained power, I wouldn't mind running her as a 4 of, but she is a very important card to this deck and helps with resource management. In the early game, she's really good for calling on like turn 2 to being able to see what you're going to drive check. Then we'll move on to the grade 1s. We run 1 of Dieglass. This card is really, really good against decks like Gundiva, who are going to be retiring your board. Because on Persona Ride turn, I can call Maple out, so I have already 1 free body. Then I call Dieglass, so that's 2 bodies. Then I use her skill of CB1, pitch a card from my hand to look at the top 2 cards in my deck. I can call up to 2 normal units, put the rest on top in any order. So with this card and Maple, you can basically build a board back. So if Gundiva retires your whole board, and you're like, oh, what am I going to do? But you have Persona Ride in your hand, use Persona Ride, call Maple, call this card, and build your board back, which is really, really strong because you're also going to be having triple drive and restand. So we run the 1 of. It does come up a lot more than I first thought it would. Then we run 2 Wretches. I really like this card in this deck. Before Sajas came out, he was a 4 of for me because this card early game is really good. If you just open up a 2 of them, you can call him down, rush kind of like how Chrono would, and then your opponent will kind of be scared to swing. They kind of want to swing into them, that way you can't CB1 to gain advantage. And what I really like to do is call him down and then call one of her down. and have a selective draw, because the skill is very similar to the grade 1 in the ride deck where you just CBO and draw. But I like having Cauldron Cast first to have a selective draw rather than to just ride up and draw a card. I want to know exactly what I'm going to draw. That way I'm lowering the odds of drawing triggers. So a really good card. I kind of want to bump him up to more than 2, but this has been a perfect number, and I think any more is just getting kind of greedy. I think 2 is a really, really solid number. Then we run 2 Replenishment Angels. Just another piece for scrying. When our Vanguard is grade 3 or greater and is standing, when you boost with her, you CB one of the top 2 cards of your deck. Put them on top or bottom in any order. So this is really good if you're out of wizards, or you have Octaray still on board but you can't use your skill since he was on place, or you have no Sajas but you have her. You just boost with that column first, the top cards of your deck, try to find triggers, or bot deck normal units to increase your odds of triggers and multi-attack. Again, this is like the wrench, where there are times where I want to bump her up, but I do think some other instance where bumping it up gets kind of greedy or lowers consistency. So I think a 2-2 split of her and the wretch is really good, and it has been working out for me all season. So I like running a 2-2 split of these cards. And then lastly, for the grade 1s, we have our 4 PGs. Our 1 Elementaria, just for when we're going up against the Stride deck sets or grade 4 decks. And then 3 of the Effect PGs. PGs are really strong, nothing much else to say about them. And then lastly, we'll go over triggers. So starting with the over trigger, I personally love the blue OT in this deck. I think the blue OT in this deck, you get much more value out of it than you would the Keter over trigger, because this card, for those that don't know, the blue OT, what it does, its skill is you give 100 mil, then you give a crit to a unit, and then you add a card back from your drop zone to hand. So what I really like to do when I check this OT is have Sajas on board. That way I can give the 100 mil to him and the crit, and let's say my opponent already has hit their over trigger, just swing with Sajas and gain their power, so it's already hitting over it. Basically, in that point, becomes like the Brant OT. But even without it, the blue OT is really good, just being able to give extra damage. Because the whole point with Hexaorb is to scry on all your triggers, multi-attack to push damage as quickly as possible. And finding this card very early with cards like Cast or the Wizard is really good. And I love adding back PGs, just another way to survive in the deck. So I personally like blue OT. But I also think Keter is still a pretty solid choice if you're running cards like Sajas like I do, because then he's going to have Twin Drive. Then we run 4 of the Effect front triggers. This is really good for powering up our front row rear guards. When we Persona Ride, instead of getting 10k, they get plus 20k. So on Persona Ride, your front row has plus 30k just for checking 1 trigger, because 10k for Persona, 20 from this. So most of the time, that's already magic number, or you're forcing like 2 to 3 cards from hand. So very, very strong. And then the reason why I run 4 is also because of decks like Wallista, where their attackers gain big number just for existing. This helps to just sometimes 1 card guard them. So I run the 4 of 20k shield. Then we run 4 heal triggers, 3 being the aesthetic matching one, and then I run 1 of the crit counter heal. This is my favorite counter heal in the whole format. There are times where I want to run 2 because there's a lot of Gundivas in our locals. But the 3-1 has been working for me. I think 2-2 gets kind of greedy, but I also understand the reason for running 2-2 split. I think this slot, though, is honestly just dependent on what your locals is, because one of the shop challenges we went to, there was a lot more restanding decks, so you can swatch this out for the restanding crit counter or restanding counter heal. This is kind of up to you, but I really, really like the crit one, especially for Gundiva being in the meta and like decks like Messiah. So then we run 4 of these crits that go to soul, just for some soul management if needed. And then we run 3 extra crits. I like running them like this just because my opponent sometimes forgets how many triggers have been out of deck already, because I see the 3 different arts. It's just a way to kind of mess with them. But 7 crit is very strong in this deck. But you could cut up 1 front down to bump it up to 8 crit just to try to kill for game very, very quickly. But that is it for the main deck. Now we're going to go over my rounds. Round 1 kind of sucked. It was a free round, so we take those. It wasn't a buy or anything. My opponent just didn't show up. You know, for those that haven't played, you have like 10, 15 minutes before the round started, but for round 1 we had 20. And a judge came into the room I was in every 5 minutes and kept asking, has your opponent shown up? And I'd be like, no, sir. And then he finally was like, okay, you just get the win. We got the free win, we take those. Then round 2, we faced Tamayura. It was a pretty straightforward game. He actually went first. Earlier today I had trouble remembering if I went first or he went first, but he went first. He got to do broken toys. He was finding his dolls. It's just he couldn't keep up with my scrying and me checking triggers because his drive checks were one trigger at most, if he was lucky to see that. And then that was actually the game where Saw just won me it because he had hit 2 defensives against me. And so I just swung with Sajas, CB1, gained his power, and Sajas swinging for like, I think it was 84, 2 crit. So it's like, what can you really do against that? So we won that one. Round 3 was pretty hype round. It was Derek Dow. I faced Derek Dow. I couldn't believe it when I saw the name on the Bushy Navi. But as fun as it was to play and meet him, it kind of sucked for me personally because I bricked hard on my scryers. I only saw 2 the whole game, and that was the Wizard and Sajas. So I got to grade 3. It wasn't a wash. But it felt kind of bad because, it's a dream fight to fight a person like Derek Dow, a fighter like him who always tops. But you couldn't really play a game against him. But it was still really fun meeting him. Then round 4, we faced... let me get my notes here. I'm starting to forget my rounds. Oh, we faced a Gundiva player. I used to be pretty scared against going Gundiva, but I played against JC a lot and just the deck a lot and our locals and top challenges we went to. So I respect the deck, but I don't fear it as much anymore. And I've learned that Hexaorb can actually really rush Gundiva, especially like I was saying earlier with my Wretches and Quadracast Wizard. And if Gundiva is very piece reliant. A lot of deck standards, but especially Gundiva, because as long as you can keep cards out of their hand that can bind or just pressure them for damage early game, it's going more in your favor, and they kind of have to sack you at that point to win. So we faced around 4 Gundiva, we won. Then around 5, we faced another Gundiva. It was a pretty good game, it was going back and forth. Unfortunately, though, I did get an automatic game loss. I was shuffling my hand like this, and then I accidentally just dropped a card, and it fell on the floor. And, Forty says it's online. It's kind of my word against his word, so I fully understood the situation. The judges were very nice. They tried their best to get us into a fixed game state where we could both keep playing. But unfortunately, they just had to give me the game loss because it's kind of hard to say that it did or did not fall out of my hand. And I don't record my games, but going forward for Bro, I'm going to start recording them just for situations like that. Overall, though, it was a fun game. I'm not going to lie, though, that game was going more in my favor. He had already guarded with OT, and he had only checked 1 trigger that turn, and I had Persona Ride, a Sajas, and a Wizard in my hand for next turn, so we would have won that game. But it was still fun. Then I guess my deck was pretty upset going after that round because we then faced a Chronojet player who was very nice, but he was new to the game. And he made it OT to pass. And I had only scryed once that turn, but I found the OT on top. And he was already at 4 damage. So we just OT'd him for game. It happens. Kind of sucks. It was a newer player, but it was very nice. And then round after that, we faced another Gundiva. Kind of just straightforward Gundiva game. I did rush him like I was doing with the other Gundiva players. He couldn't really keep up. He did get 2 best harvest turns, but off my scries, I just kept finding PGs or front triggers. So it just helped me keep up in the game, and we ended up getting it. And then last round was kind of funny. We faced a Youthberg player. And so for those of you that don't know, in Bro, they have a deck log, a list of all the deck logs of all the players public. And so you can check that whenever you want during your match. Before, after, during your round, you can check it. So all day, my opponents were checking the deck log. They're letting me know they're looking at it. But nobody said anything. And then I faced my last round opponent, and before our game started, he goes, "Are you really running a heal trigger as your starter?" I was like, "What are you talking about?" And so he pointed out that, and judges didn't catch this, none of my opponents caught it, I didn't catch it. I had accidentally registered my deck with the heal trigger as my starter. And so we played the game out because he was like, "I know what you meant. I'm not going to, try to get you DQ'd or I'm going to game loss, final round." So we played it out. We ended up getting it, but it was also funny because he had a single color matte Dragon Shield sleeves. And I used to use those a lot. And for anyone that runs those or has face points to know those, sometimes they kind of bleed into each other when they're stacked on top, especially if they're like face down in damage zone. So he was already at 5 damage. And on my last turn, he took a damage. He went to 6. But we both didn't realize that. So he started playing out his next turn. And I had made Youthberg 1 to pass. So he checked healed down to 5. And then his second check was a healing trigger. Healed down to 4. And I was like, hey, yo, wait a minute. And so we both realized at that second that he had already lost. And what happened to be that a judge had just joined our table. And so he unmuted himself and he was like, yeah, so I joined right before you did those checks. And I wasn't sure if they were damages or drive checks. But once I saw you were at 6, I was like, hey, that's a funny looking greedo you got there. So we just started laughing. He was a really nice guy. It was a weird game also because JC hates this, but that was one of those games where I just always check defensives, like without even scrying, or like when I couldn't scry, I would just have triggers on top of my deck. So it was like every time he would try to push damage, I would just have a defensive. So easy to win word, but
disgusting behavior. Yeah.
Not punished at all for playing the game.
Ever.
So it was a really fun game, but it was kind of weird. But overall, standard BRO was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, we couldn't top, but like I said, I had an X2 record. It was a lot of fun. Next event is Bro Premium. I believe it's in a month or 2. Very excited for that. Don't know.
Well, before that, we'll have Houston.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, we're going to Race for the Case event hosted by Infinity Cards in Houston. So if you're in the local area, I would definitely recommend checking it out. It's in 2 weeks from now. It's going to be on a Saturday. I don't remember the exact date.
September 9th.
September 9th. So we're going to be there. Our team is going to be split into like 2 or 3 teams. So been looking out for Team Empire there. But overall, that was my deck profile. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Got some insight into Hexaorb. I really like this deck. It is my favorite competitive deck in Overdress right now. For those of y'all that have watched our content, Orpheus will always be my favorite deck. But this deck is really strong. It's it's not as strong as like Gundiva or Ballista, but I think it can stand next to them and compete with them. And like I said, I took down 2, would have been 3 Gundivas if I hadn't gotten the automatic game loss. But overall, I hope y'all enjoyed the video. Check back for more content later and have a good day.
I'm just going to zoom in on Daisy.
W10s.